The widow next door knocked on my door and said she missed touch, and just like that, my quiet life changed forever. The apartment was quiet, quieter than usual, the kind of silence that pressed against my ears and made even the soft hum of the refrigerator seem loud. I had just poured myself a cup of instant coffee, the steam curling up and carrying a faint, bitter warmth, when there was a knock at the door. Not a hurried knock, or a polite, tentative one. It was deliberate, measured, almost intimate, as if the person behind it had already made up their mind to cross the threshold into my life. I frowned, glancing at the door through the haze of morning light spilling across the kitchen tiles. I wasn't expecting anyone. I wasn't particularly close to my neighbors. Apartments like ours were transient. People came and went, preferring their solitude. But this knock, it lingered in my chest, a small prickle of unease, curiosity, and something I couldn't quite name. When I opened it, she was there. She looked impossibly poised in a way that seemed effortless. Early 40s, perhaps, with soft lines around her eyes that hinted at laughter, grief, and everything in between. Her hair was pulled back loosely, a few strands falling gracefully along her face, and her clothes suggested comfort, but also a quiet elegance. She looked at me directly, eyes steady, and her voice, when it came, was low, calm, and intimate. "I miss touch," she said, her lips curving in a small, almost wistful smile. "Don't you?" Her words were so unexpected, so raw in their simplicity, that my chest tightened. I found myself momentarily speechless, staring at her hand as it lingered near the edge of the door frame. When I instinctively stepped forward, our hands brushed, briefly, almost accidentally. The warmth of her skin lingered far longer than it should have, and a quiet, unfamiliar awareness settled over me, like the soft afterglow of a fading spark. I noticed everything about her in that moment. The subtle scent of lavender mixed with something woodsy and grounded, the faint tremor in her fingers, the way her eyes seemed to hold a quiet, patient longing. I realized, with a small, unsettling thrill, that she wasn't just lonely in the abstract way people often are. She was lonely in the way that demanded connection, in the way that a life without touch can quietly ache. I wanted to step back, to retreat to the safety of routine and distance, but something about her presence made that impossible. Her gaze was patient, unguarded, as if she already knew the answer I hadn't even formulated in my mind. I felt a strange mixture of fear and fascination, my own solitude mirrored in hers. I swallowed, finally finding my voice, but the words came out quieter than I intended. "I didn't expect." She tilted her head slightly, a smile that was neither flirty nor forced, just simple acknowledgement, curling her lips like a secret waiting to be shared. "No one does," she said softly. And then she waited, just waited. I realized, with a fluttering awareness, that this moment, this simple knock in her words, was the beginning of something I hadn't realized I'd been missing. And for the first time in months, maybe years, I felt the quiet stirrings of curiosity, of anticipation, and of a touch I didn't even know I longed for. The days after her visit carried a strange weight. I found myself noticing the small details in the apartment complex, the soft echo of her footsteps in the hallway, the faint sound of her key turning in the lock, even the way her voice lingered in memory long after she had gone. It was impossible to act normal, impossible to ignore the subtle pull I felt toward her presence. Our encounters began casually. I would see her near the mailbox, or she would appear in the hallway while I was fumbling with groceries. Each time, the world seemed to narrow to the space between us. She would lean slightly closer, or I would step a little too near while handing her a package. Each brush of arms, each fleeting touch, was like a small shock, a spark that left warmth trailing along my skin long after she had turned away. There was a rhythm to it, an unspoken understanding growing in these short moments. She would laugh softly at something mundane I said, and I noticed the way her hand would linger on my arm for just a heartbeat longer than necessary. It wasn't flirtation, it was intimacy in its most delicate form, a subtle declaration of trust and attention. I began to pay attention to the nuances of her presence. The tilt of her head when she was curious, the softness of her hair brushing against her neck when she moved, the way her eyes held something unsaid when she smiled. Each detail made the world feel more vivid, more alive. My own emotions, which had been quiet, simmering beneath routine and solitude, began to surface in ways I hadn't expected. One evening, she stopped by unexpectedly with a small package for me. Something mundane, really, yet it became a reason to linger. Our hands touched briefly as she handed it over, and I felt a shiver that had nothing to do with the cool evening air. I caught myself studying the curve of her wrist, the warmth radiating from her fingers, and the gentle pulse beneath her skin that made her feel startlingly alive, startlingly present. Her voice was different up close, soft, calm, and measured, yet carrying a hint of something unspoken, something intimate. She asked about my day, and I noticed how my chest lifted just to hear her speak, how my heart seemed to stumble at the simplicity of her words. The world outside the apartment faded, leaving only the space between us and the quiet tension that was growing there, subtle but insistent. By the time she left, I was acutely aware of the absence her presence created. I realized that I was waiting for these brief interactions, craving the accidental touches, the small gestures that had begun to mean so much. And in that quiet longing, I understood something profound. It wasn't just her hand, her proximity, or her voice. It was the feeling of being seen, of being noticed in a way that was both tender and quietly electrifying. I closed the door behind her and leaned against it, letting the warmth of her lingering presence settle into me. For the first time in a long while, I was aware not only of my own loneliness, but of the possibility of connection and of touch that might yet bloom between us. It started as a casual evening, nothing remarkable, yet it became one of those moments that linger in memory far longer than they should. She had knocked again, this time with a faint smile that carried neither urgency nor hesitation, just quiet purpose. "I thought you might help me with the balcony plants," she said softly, as if the suggestion were as ordinary as borrowing sugar. Yet, somehow, ordinary never felt ordinary in her presence. I followed her into the small apartment, noting the faint scent of jasmine and wood polish that clung to her. The place was neat but lived in, a home carefully curated yet softened by traces of life. Books stacked on the table, a scarf draped casually over a chair, and photographs that hinted at a life lived fully, if quietly mourned. She moved with a fluid grace, the kind that made the simplest gesture, reaching for a plant, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear, feel intimate without effort. We worked in companionable silence at first. I watered the plants she had tended with such care, and she adjusted the pots, guiding my hands when necessary. Each time our fingers brushed, a nudge while moving a pot, the passing of a watering can, the sensation seemed amplified, the warmth lingering far longer than reason would allow. There was no rush, no urgency, only the slow, deliberate rhythm of two people existing in the same space, noticing each other in ways that went unspoken. She began talking, softly at first, about her late husband, not the details of grief, but fragments of memory, a favorite coffee mug, a joke only they understood, the way he would hum while cooking. There was a subtle weight in her voice, a quiet vulnerability, as if she were testing the air before allowing herself to be fully heard. I listened, carefully, sensing the unspoken invitation for connection, and in return, I shared small pieces of my life, mundane confessions, moments of solitude, the quiet ache of long evenings spent alone. As the conversation unfolded, our physical proximity became natural. I found myself brushing against her shoulder while reaching for a pot. She leaned slightly closer, seemingly unconcerned, and the warmth of her presence pressed gently against me. At one point, she handed me a small pruning tool, and our fingers met, lingering just enough for me to feel the gentle pulse beneath her skin. The moment was fleeting, yet it carried the weight of something unspoken, a quiet acknowledgement of shared solitude that neither of us needed to name. We sat on the balcony afterward, the evening air soft and fragrant with the city's faint hum. Her legs brushed mine lightly against the railing, a casual closeness that felt astonishingly intimate. I became aware of the small rhythm of her breathing, the steady warmth of her shoulder against my arm, the faint scent of her hair mingling with the night air. There was no pressure, no expectation, just the quiet understanding that being near her, simply existing in this shared space, was enough. When she finally stood to leave, I felt a reluctant pull, as though the evening's small intimacy had left a tangible mark on me. Her smile was gentle, her eyes carrying a warmth that lingered long after the door closed. I realized, then, that what I had felt in her presence was more than curiosity. It was a stirring awareness of connection, a longing for touch, companionship, and understanding that had quietly rooted itself within me. For the first time in a long while, I recognized that solitude didn't have to be lonely, and perhaps, in her quiet company, it could be something richer, something that hinted at the beginning of a slow, fragile intimacy. The days that followed our shared evening on the balcony carried a strange, almost magnetic tension. It wasn't dramatic or overwhelming. It was quieter, more insidious, like a gentle current pulling at the edges of my awareness. I noticed her in ways I hadn't before. The subtle tilt of her head when she listened, the way her fingers lingered on objects she passed to me, the small, almost imperceptible brushing of her arm against mine in casual proximity. Each moment, however brief, carried weight. It started with little excuses to be near her. I would help carry her groceries when she was running late, or offer to adjust a shelf while she sorted through books. She would laugh softly at something I said, leaning closer in a way that was unintentional yet intimate. And in those brief touches, I felt a warmth that lingered, an awareness of her presence that pressed gently against the quiet corners of my chest. One afternoon, she invited me over to help with a minor repair in her kitchen, a loose cabinet hinge that needed tightening. We worked side by side, our bodies brushing accidentally on purpose. Each collision of shoulder or elbow sent a subtle shiver up my spine, a reminder of her nearness. I found myself studying the curve of her wrist, the warmth of her hand when she guided mine, the soft cadence of her voice as she offered instructions. It was intimate without words, a closeness that felt electric in its restraint. There were moments when neither of us spoke. Standing near the counter, hands resting on opposite sides of a cutting board, we would catch each other's gaze and hold it just long enough to feel the quiet tension in the air. Her eyes softened when she looked at me, and I realized that the longing I felt was mirrored in her steady, unspoken glances. There was no need for grand gestures. The subtlety of our closeness said everything. One evening, while preparing tea, her hand brushed mine as she passed the cup. The contact was brief, fleeting, but enough to make my pulse jump and leave a warmth spreading through my chest. I noticed the softness of her fingers, the gentle pressure as if she were testing the space between us. Her smile, calm and steady, carried a weight that words could never convey, a mix of trust, longing, and a quiet recognition of our growing intimacy. Even the mundane moments were charged with an unexpected significance. A shared joke, a laugh that lingered, the casual leaning closer while reaching for the same object, all became threads weaving an invisible connection between us. The apartment, the hallway, even the small balcony where we had shared silence, felt charged with anticipation. Each lingering touch, each small collision of movement, carried the weight of emotions unspoken but deeply felt. By the time I left her apartment that evening, the warmth of her presence seemed to cling to me, a faint echo that made the apartment feel colder in her absence. I realized that what had started as curiosity had deepened into something more profound, a silent, patient intimacy that didn't need words to exist. And for the first time, I began to understand that the space between two people, when charged with subtle touches and quiet glances, could be more revealing than any confession. It was a rainy evening, the kind that presses softly against windows and makes the city feel smaller, quieter. I had been lost in the familiar hum of my apartment, half absorbed in a book, when there was a knock at the door. My heart picked up, not out of surprise this time, but with a strange, anticipatory rhythm that I had come to recognize in the past weeks. She was standing there, a small umbrella clutched in her hand, water dripping from the edges of her coat. Her hair was damp, framing her face in a way that made her look both fragile and fiercely alive. Her eyes met mine with that steady, open gaze I had grown to both anticipate and cherish. She stepped inside without ceremony, letting the rainwater gather in soft puddles at her feet. I miss touch, she said quietly, almost as if speaking it aloud made it less real. I haven't really felt someone beside me in a long time. There was no accusation, no desperate plea, just an honesty that cut through the small walls I had built around my own solitude. Her words hung between us, delicate and fragile, and I felt the weight of my own loneliness rising to the surface. I realized that I, too, had been craving connection, craving the simple comfort of proximity, the quiet reassurance that comes from shared space and warmth. I, I understand, I admitted, my voice low, careful. It's hard, sometimes, being alone. We moved toward the living room, a hesitant gravity pulling us into closer proximity. I noticed the way her shoulders relaxed when she leaned slightly against the armrest of the couch, and the faint scent of rain and lavender that clung to her hair filled the space between us. I sat across from her, close enough that our knees brushed lightly under the coffee table. It was a small contact, almost accidental, yet it carried a weight neither of us ignored. Her hand rested lightly on her lap, fingers tapping softly against the fabric of her pants. I reached out almost instinctively, covering her hand with mine. The warmth of her skin seeped into mine, grounding me in a way I hadn't realized I needed. She didn't pull away. Instead, she tilted her head slightly, her eyes meeting mine with a quiet, vulnerable honesty. That touch, simple, unhurried, deliberate, was more intimate than anything either of us had said. We sat in silence for a long moment, just breathing, feeling the subtle rhythm of each other's presence. The space between us was charged, yet calm, a balance of restraint and recognition, a delicate acknowledgement of something deep and unspoken. In that silence, I felt her trust, her longing, and, perhaps most importantly, her willingness to let someone see her as she truly was. When she finally spoke again, it was a whisper. It's been so long since I felt seen. Her words were tender, vulnerable, and unguarded. I squeezed her hand gently, my own voice barely audible. You are seen. I see you. In that simple exchange, the quiet yearning that had been building between us found its voice, if only through touch and eye contact. The loneliness that had pressed on us both now felt shared, understood, and, in its own subtle way, less heavy. That evening, I realized that our connection was no longer just curiosity or fleeting attraction. It was becoming a lifeline, a slow-burning intimacy that neither of us could, or wanted, to ignore. The evening started innocuously enough. She had asked me to help her move a small piece of furniture, a chair that was slightly too heavy for her alone. I didn't think much of it at first, assuming it would be just another task, another quiet excuse to be near her. But the moment we were in the same room, the air seemed different, charged with a subtle, almost electric anticipation that neither of us acknowledged directly. We lifted the chair together, our hands brushing repeatedly as we adjusted our grip. Each contact was accidental yet deliberate, lingering just a fraction too long for casual comfort. My heart thudded against my chest, sharp and insistent, and I felt the warmth of her palms against mine in a way that made my own skin tingle. She laughed softly, a sound that seemed to vibrate in the small space, and our eyes met, steady, unflinching, holding a quiet awareness of what neither wanted to name aloud. The chair finally found its place near the window, and we stepped back simultaneously, our movements slower than necessary. She straightened her hair, fingers grazing her neck, and I noticed the curve of her shoulder as she exhaled softly. The space between us had shrunk without our realizing it. We were close enough that I could feel the faint heat radiating from her, her presence pressing gently against the edge of my awareness. Then, a small misstep. She stumbled slightly, perhaps distracted by the tight space. Instinctively, I reached out, catching her by the arm. Her hand rested lightly on my chest as I steadied her, our bodies close enough that I could feel the subtle rhythm of her heartbeat. For a moment, the world narrowed to the faint rise and fall of her chest against mine, the warmth of her hand, and the soft, shared breath in the room. Words felt unnecessary. Everything important had already been communicated through proximity, touch, and lingering glances. She straightened, and our hands lingered together, neither willing to move first. Her eyes met mine, searching, soft, a quiet acknowledgement of the tension we had both been holding back. I could sense her awareness of the unspoken pull between us, and my own hesitation melted into the careful courage to let the moment exist fully, without rushing, without forcing words. We moved to the balcony to take a breath, the night air cool against our flushed cheeks. Standing side by side, her shoulder brushed mine, fingers occasionally touching as we adjusted our positions. The brush was electric, subtle, yet impossible to ignore. The gentle sway of the city lights below mirrored the unsteady beat of my heart. Even in silence, there was communication. The way she leaned slightly toward me, the tilt of her head, the soft exhale that seemed to draw me closer. I felt her warmth, the faint scent of her hair, and the rhythm of her presence next to mine, and it became clear. This was no longer just curiosity or fleeting attraction. It was the undeniable awareness of a bond, quiet yet charged, and entirely ours. By the time we stepped back inside, the invisible barrier between us had shifted. Neither words nor confessions were needed to acknowledge it. The shared brush of hands, the lingering closeness, and the gentle awareness of each other's presence had broken through the last remnants of restraint. The next evening, I found myself waiting in my apartment with a quiet awareness that something had shifted between us. The brush of her hand, the warmth of her shoulder, the unspoken electricity of the night before lingered in my thoughts like a soft echo, making every small sound, the hum of the fridge, the ticking of the clock, feel magnified. When the knock came at my door, it was no longer startling. It was welcome, anticipated, as though the world had subtly tilted in her direction. She stepped inside, carrying a simple bouquet of flowers from a nearby market, their scent faint but comforting. Her eyes met mine, steady, warm, and unguarded. "I thought you might like these," she said softly, her smile quiet but luminous. I felt my chest tighten, not from the flowers themselves, but from the simple, deliberate act of thoughtfulness that mirrored everything she had been to me in the past weeks. Presence, attention, care. We moved to the living room, settling into the couch side by side. The proximity was natural, no longer awkward or accidental. Her leg brushed mine lightly, a gentle contact that sent warmth along my skin, and her head tilted slightly, resting softly against my shoulder. I instinctively adjusted my arm, wrapping it gently around her back, feeling the curve of her shoulder and the steady pulse of her heartbeat through the fabric of her sweater. There was no rush, no sense of urgency, only the quiet comfort of presence. We didn't need words to acknowledge the months of unspoken tension, the growing intimacy, the subtle longing that had threaded through every brush of our hands, every lingering glance. The silence was full, rich with everything we hadn't said but had felt deeply. The city outside blurred into a quiet hum, a backdrop to the small, meaningful details. The scent of her hair brushing against my cheek, the warmth of her hand as it found mine and intertwined effortlessly with my fingers, the slow, steady rhythm of her breathing against my chest. At one point, she shifted slightly, her hand brushing lightly across my wrist in a way that was deliberate but gentle. I caught her gaze and smiled, feeling an unspoken acknowledgement pass between us. This was a beginning, not an end. Our connection didn't need grand declarations or dramatic confessions. It existed in the quiet, in the shared space between us, in the gentle, sustained touches that said more than words ever could. As the evening wore on, I found myself reflecting on the months that had led to this moment. Her presence had softened the edges of my solitude. Her warmth had filled spaces I hadn't realized were empty, and her quiet confidence had given me permission to allow myself to feel again. And in return, I had learned to be seen, to share vulnerability, and to recognize that intimacy could be tender, patient, and enduring. When she finally stood to leave, I held her hand a moment longer, letting my thumb brush across hers. She gave a soft smile, a whisper of a laugh, and pressed a gentle kiss to my cheek. A quiet, affirming gesture that needed no words. The door closed behind her, and I stood in the lingering warmth of her presence, feeling the echo of her touch, the quiet ache of anticipation, and the deep satisfaction of a connection that had grown carefully, beautifully, and entirely naturally. For the first time in a long while, I understood. Connection, intimacy, and touch didn't need to be loud or dramatic. Sometimes, the quietest moments, held slowly and deliberately, could change everything.